Turn with me, if you would, to Joshua chapter 3. And this is week 3 of our series called The Living God is Among You. Our custom here is to work our way through books of the Bible, one section at a time, keeping the text in the context and always looking to see how the story we're in, the smaller story, fits within the larger story. Joshua is a book filled with what you might call coffee mug sayings and t-shirt slogans. Be strong and courageous. We've seen that already. And we'll see later, as for me and my house, I will serve the Lord. It's all inspirational stuff, to be sure. But there's so much more to it than that, as we've been seeing. Joshua is a story, a true story, about the only God who's ever lived, the only God there is, and the way that he looks after his people. If you've ever been asked to do something by someone in authority, but not really been given instructions as to how you are to do that. Or maybe you've been told to do something, but informed the instructions would come later. So you've been told to do it, but you told that the instructions will come to you later. Well, what do you do while you're waiting? How are you wired? Do you just kind of chill and wait to get instructions? Or are you the type who wants to get started doing something, and so you just kind of figure you're going to feel your way through it until the instructions arrive? My friend Chris, who lives in California, worked for 30 years for FedEx and started out as a driver and then worked his way up to warehouse manager and ended up retiring as some high-ranking operations guy. One time Chris shared with me how he determined whether or not to hire someone for a management role. He said he made his decision based on two things. One, he said he would watch how fast a person walked. So he would actually be up in his office, and when he would set up an interview, he would watch from that office to see how the interviewee approached the building. Did he or she just kind of meander around in a distracted way, or did this person walk with purpose? He said he only hired people who walk with purpose. The second criterion was he would put interviewees in a group of folks, and then he would give them a task without giving them any sort of clear instructions. And then he would send into that group a spy, so to speak, who would watch everyone and then report back to him on who just sat and waited versus who was proactive in trying to get things started, maybe build relationships. And he said he wanted proactive people, the ones who took charge, not the ones who just waited around. Well, so far in the story of Joshua, God has promised Joshua and the Israelite people this land. He said, I'm going to give you this land. This land will be your home. It will be the home for your children and grandchildren and descendants even beyond that. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's just that God hasn't given Joshua any instructions on how Joshua is supposed to take that land. And the problem is the land is actually currently occupied by some really bad people. Bad people with weapons who are well-trained for battle and who live behind a towering, doubly secure wall. How will Joshua overtake these people? We saw last week from chapter 2 that Joshua sent out 2 spies to scout the land, to see what exactly they were up against. And then 3 days later, the spies come back and they tell the people, they have this incredible, almost unbelievable report. They say the people are melting in fear at what they've heard about our God. They say the land is ready for us to take it. God will give it to us. And so Joshua, after waiting, says now it's time to cross the river. So God will meet with them and God will deliver them, as we're going to see here in just a minute. And as the story continues to unfold, we're going to see 3 things this morning that have, I think, tremendous relevance for us. 1, how to prepare for a meeting with God. 2, why God's timing seems so mysterious and sometimes seems late in our estimation. And then finally, we're going to look at the pathway home that God has provided for us. So how to prepare for a meeting with God, why God's timing is so mysterious at times, and then we're going to look at the pathway that God has provided home. So Joshua chapter 3, let me start just by reading verses 1 and 2. We'll cover the whole chapter. It's some 17 verses. Here reads the word of the Lord. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim, and they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, As soon as you, well, that's actually verse 3. I'll get to that in a minute, but I want to pause there because there's something about this book, and if you've read it, you realize this. It makes it it's very confusing to understand in one sense because of the way the story is told. Sometimes there are flashbacks, and other times there are flash forwards. This is kind of all the rage these days in television series and movies. You're constantly sort of toggling between the present, the future, back to the past. Well, this happens in multiple places in Joshua's the book here. In fact, when we get to chapter 4 next week, we're going to see, when we read chapter 4, it looks like they actually crossed the Jordan twice, but they don't. They only cross it once, but it's kind of the way the story is told. Well, here, Joshua chapter 3 and verse 1 is actually a flashback, you might say. All the stuff we read about in chapter 2 with Rahab and the spies we looked at last week, that's a parenthetical, it's a side note. The 3 days when the spies were gone were the same 3 days that the people camped at the banks of the Jordan River waiting to move. Those are the same 3 days that the people are getting their stuff together, they're resting, they're presumably pleading to God for more specific instructions. And when we read in verse 3:1 that I just read, that the people and Joshua rose up early and set out from Shittim, which was about 5 miles from the banks of the Jordan River, that actually happened when the spies were sent out, not when they returned. So hopefully this will make more sense as we go along. When the spies returned, which is where we find ourselves here in Joshua 3, chapter 3 and following, it's go time. The people they're already at the Jordan River. They're there. It's time. Tomorrow morning, they will wake up and they will cross the river. And finally, they get some more specific instructions from the Lord. Look at verses 3 through 6. So the officers commanded the people, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And Joshua said to the priests, take up the ark of the covenant and pass on before the people. So they took up the ark of the covenant and went before the people. So how will the people get across the Jordan River? God tells them to locate the ark of the covenant, which will be carried by the priests into the river, and the people are supposed to follow the Ark of the Covenant without deviation. So God's the main actor in the story, but if there were a main supporting character, we might say, it's actually the Ark of the Covenant. 17 times in chapters 3 and 4, we read about the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, as you know, was not some magical trinket or mystical treasure box. It was the chest that was made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold. And it contained in it 3 main things. The 2 tablets on which were written the 10 words. We know the 10 commandments. It had Aaron's staff in it after it had budded. And it also contained a jar of manna. But what's so significant about the Ark of the Covenant is the Ark of the Covenant represented the very presence of God. It was God's mobile throne, we might say. It was where God determined to make his presence manifest among his people. Now, of course, we know he is omnipresent. He's present all the time in every single place. But he made his presence uniquely rest, again, among his people by the Ark of the Covenant. When the people were told to keep their distance from the priests who would carry the Ark of the Covenant, that was for a couple of reasons, but here the reason articulated is for visibility, so they could see the Ark of the Covenant, so they would know the Ark of the Covenant is in front of me, it's moving in that direction, and that's the direction I'm supposed to follow. They're supposed to stay at least 2,000 cubits, which is about a half a mile from the Ark of the Covenant, and then follow behind. That was the guide to cross the Jordan River. If you've ever done any rock climbing, or you've tried to guide a child or a friend, maybe a frightened friend, over a high swinging bridge or through rocky sort of tenuous terrain, then you probably said this: look, keep your eyes on me, just follow my lead, Don't look around. Don't look down. Don't worry about what's around you. Just focus on me. Well, this was God's way of saying something similar. Look, don't look at the river. Don't look around. Don't look ahead to see where your enemies may be. They were to stay focused on the Ark of the Covenant, and that was going to be their guide. Now, before they were to go, though, they were to consecrate themselves. Verse 5 is so powerful. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. This whole story is, we're going to see, and many of you are already thinking in these terms, it has so many similarities to the Exodus event when God delivered his people who were enslaved to Egypt. They crossed over the Red Sea, crossed over on dry land. Well, after God rescued the people of Israel from slavery to the Egyptians by way of, again, the Exodus, he met with them at the base of the mountain, and in anticipation of them coming to him, or him coming to them, they were to prepare themselves to meet with God, just like the people of Israel are told here in Joshua chapter 3. Now, this would involve washing their clothes, confessing their sins, sometimes temporarily abstaining from regular pleasures, for sexual intimacy, for example. This consecration was a symbolic cleansing that represented them dedicating themselves to the Lord. They were there ready to hear, ready to listen, ready to receive the promises of God. So they got ready for it. They didn't do it haphazardly. They got ready for it. And you say, well, what does that have to do with us? Well, actually, this type of preparation would become the paradigm for meeting with God even today. There's something unique that happens when God's people gather together. We see this throughout redemptive history from the Old Testament into the New. We see God, he draws near to his people in a very special way when they willingly gather together to worship. Again, as I said a minute ago, God's everywhere. We know he's everywhere. He's always present everywhere. The psalmist says, where can I go from your presence? The depth of the sea? No, there's nowhere I can flee your presence. And yet, even though he's always everywhere at every moment, when God's people gather together, he visits them in a special way. Do you realize that God is with us right now in a way that is actually unlike his presence with us at any other time during the week? Ed Clowney, who's a New Testament scholar, author, says this: in our worship in Christ's church, we approach the throne of God, the judge of all. We enter the festive assembly of the saints and the angels. We gather in spirit with the spirits of just men made perfect. So God, he attends to us. He meets with us in a unique way when we gather on the Lord's day. And there's a precedent established, again, going back to the Old Testament, that when God promises to meet with his gathered people, they should consecrate themselves in preparation for that meeting. That doesn't mean, of course, we have to wash our clothes before we gather, although that might be nice for the people sitting next to you. But to consecrate ourselves means to make spiritual preparations. It means to prepare ourselves to hear from the voice of God. I've heard people, of course, legalistically apply this, and I'm sure you have as well. They say on Saturday night, you shouldn't watch TV, you shouldn't go to bed, you should go to bed by 9 p.m., you shouldn't drink caffeine, you shouldn't play games of any kind. You should just prepare yourselves, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually for that gathering. Certainly, some people go too far. But I wonder if we don't go far enough, frankly. I wonder if we don't prepare our hearts to meet with God. Do we get rest so that we're not dozing off on Sunday morning? Do we get up early enough to get our kids in their respective places? Do we come with a sense of expectation? Do we come ready to hear from the Lord? Have we already read the passage ahead of time so we're familiar with the text? Have we prepared ourselves for this meeting with God? What if we're not getting as much because we're not preparing enough? One commentator says, if we're not impressed with the grandeur of the living God in public worship, is it because we've not prepared ourselves to see him as such, Could it be that we fail to detect the Lord's marvelous working in the routine affairs of our lives simply because we have not prepared ourselves to see or even expect that? Again, I'm not trying to impose any sort of legalistic requirements on your Saturdays, but I think one of the great benefits of, I'm sure of it, us gathering together for worship is we get to see the testimonies of God's faithfulness in baptism and conversion. We hear stories from our friends about prayers answered. We read about God's work throughout history. We hear him speak through his word proclaimed. We are reminded of his perfect and loving character, and through what we hear and we experience on the Lord's Day, we're actually better able to detect his regular workings in sort of the routine experiences of our lives. The people of Israel were ready to meet with God. They prepared themselves for it. Preparation is important. Here's our first point. Every Lord's Day represents an opportunity to meet with God and to reorient our perspective to see his gracious work in every detail of our lives. So much of our lives is about perspective, isn't it? It's how we see things. You know, I've met with people, I've been with people, a lot of people, as they are either dying or they've just lost a loved one. And it's interesting to me the way people respond sometimes. I've been with people, two different people over the years who've lost a parent, for example, in their mid-80s. And I've been around people who just, the only thing they could think of was, why, God, did you take my mom from me? Why did you take my dad from me? And I've been around people who've also lost parents in their 80s, and what in their perspective is, God, how gracious that you would allow me 8.5 decades with my parent. Now, of course, I'm not saying we shouldn't grieve. We should grieve. I'm not saying that our hearts shouldn't hurt. Our hearts should hurt. But perspective really matters. And even as we look at the regular things in our lives every day, the things that we go through, the things we experience, how do we look at those? Do we say, well, that just sort of fell into place, or that was kind of a random event, or how lucky I must be that happened? Or do we actually see behind all of those events the sovereign hand of a loving Father? Well, what happens on the Lord's Day gathering as we prepare ourselves is we learn to see afresh all that God has done and all that he's doing and all that he's promised us. We learn to realize that he's actually doing wonders among us, just like he said to the people of Israel. So what we're doing is we set ourselves unto God, as we're saying, much like the Israelites at the Jordan as they prepared, Lord, I'm keeping my eyes on you. I can only see what's directly in front of me, but I trust you with the whole picture. I'm not going to get sidetracked by potential threats or things that could happen to me in the future or what I may go through. I am anticipating you to do something for my good and your glory, something that's actually beyond even my imagination. When we gather on the Lord's Day, the Lord is the one who does the work. We come to receive, but we come ready to receive, prepared for it. Now look at verses 7 through 13. The Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And as for you, command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. And Joshua said to the people of Israel, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, here is how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man. And when the soles of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing, and the waters coming from above shall stand in one heap. Now notice, Joshua made no plans to exalt himself, but the Lord said, I'm going to exalt you among these people. Kind of reminds me of what's said throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, even the wisdom literature. God says, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. So Joshua tells the people to draw near. He wants everyone in the crowd to hear, so that they know what the Lord has said. And as it always happens in the Bible, instructions are accompanied by encouragement, demands come with promises. Law is paired with gospel. What God tells us to do is enveloped in the reminders of what he himself has done and promised to do. God's about ready to do a miracle. He's going to stop the flow of a raging river. This is, by the way, not something they can't imagine. They can imagine this because even though they weren't around for it, they've heard their parents and their grandparents talk about, their great-grandparents perhaps even, talk about how God stopped the Dead Sea, how God gave them a plague. He caused the Dead Sea to divide so they could walk through on dry land. So this is something for which they had a category, but still they're thinking about bringing their own children and their possessions, their babies, their livestock, all of this through a raging river. The Jordan River, like pretty much all rivers, was wider at some places than others and deeper in some spots than others. In some places it was only about 100 feet wide and ranged from 3 feet deep to about 10 to 12 feet deep, and it was wider in other places. Here where the Israelites would cross, it was actually one of the narrower sections. They would cross about 16 miles south of a town called Adam, and there the river was only about 100 feet wide. Normally it was 100 feet wide. But as we're going to see in a moment, this was flood season. So it was unlike any other time of the year. Now there are two titles that are used by God in the section that I just read that are kind of repeated. And when something is repeated in the Bible, it's cause for us to draw attention to it. Two descriptions of God. One is that the Lord is the living God. And the second phrase is that he is Lord of all the earth. This God, unlike all the other gods made by clay, wood, iron, and gold, dead gods who weren't really gods at all, of course, this God is alive. He is living. And his power and reign are not relegated to some small geographic area. He is the Lord of all the earth. Egypt even belongs to him. He's the Lord there. Canaan belongs to him. He's the Lord there. Jericho belongs to him. He is the only God there is. He's the only God there is anywhere because he is in fact the only God. Now, why the reminder? Well, the people are about ready to enter into the land of Canaan where there were thousands of gods. I mean, gods of just about anything you can imagine was made to be a god. Gods of clay, gods of wood, gods of stone, gods of gold, gods with clever looking and uniquely designed gods they can hold in their hands, gods they can bow down in front of. And the temptation might be to become enamored by all of these clever-looking gods everywhere, instead of the God who delivered them. In fact, we read something really powerful in Deuteronomy chapters 11 and 12. What God says to the people before they take the land, he says, "For you are about to cross the Jordan River to take over the land the Lord your God is giving you." And then he says, when you take that land and are living in it, when you drive out the nations that live there, do not inquire about their gods, saying, how do these nations worship their gods? I want to follow their example. You must destroy all the places where they worship their gods, high on the mountains, up on the hills, and under every green tree. Break down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, burn their Asherah poles, and cut down their carved idols. Completely erase, the Lord says, the names of their gods. Now we might think, we hear the stories and again, these people have heard stories from their parents and grandparents about all that God has done, and they're about ready to experience God do this incredible miracle, which I'll read in just a moment. You might think, well, surely, after all they've seen and heard, and for all God has done for them, there's no way they're going to appeal to or be tempted by these idols that are just made with materials. But as we know the story, they do succumb to the idol worship. They give idols the place that only God deserves. And the fact of the matter is, so do we. Not idols we can see or touch, mainly, but what Ezekiel calls the idols of our hearts, the things in our lives that so captivate our hearts that we think, if I didn't have that, I don't know why I would even go on living. The things that have a stranglehold on our attention and take top place in our priorities. An idol, by the way, is not always an intrinsically bad thing. It's often a good thing that's been elevated to an ultimate thing. This is language that Tim Keller made famous, and John Calvin, the reformer, said that our idols are, our hearts rather, are idol factories, constantly cranking out substitutes for God. And this passage calls us to be more wary about our own idols. What are those things in your life that you look to for ultimate meaning and joy? Is it status? Is it money? Is it health? Is it security? Is it significance? Is it athleticism? Is it reputation? What are the idols of our hearts? I have to be very candid with you. Almost every time I get sick, I realize that I make my health sometimes an idol. It just takes a place where God belongs. These idols have to be smashed, which doesn't mean that we necessarily get rid of things that are good that we've elevated to improper place. I mean, if food is an idol for you, it's not that you just give up food and never eat again. Those things just have to be dethroned. We have to learn how to find satisfaction in the Lord instead. Now look at how this actually works out, verses 14 through 17. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priests, bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water, now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest, the waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Verathon, and those flowing down toward the sea of Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. And the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel was passing over the dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. Maybe you've been in church a long time. You say, well, hey, I remember this story about the Exodus, but I don't remember this story. Well, God did exactly what he said he would do. The waters of the river stopped flowing. The people of Israel walked across the riverbed on dry land. Their sandals didn't even get muddy. Nothing. They didn't get wet. God stopped the flow of the river back at the city of Adam, which was, as I mentioned, some 16 miles north. And so instead of the rivers just flowing, the rivers just went up and formed this wall of water. Now, verse 14 offers an interesting side note. It says, now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. And we read that and we think, okay, wait a second. The people have wandered around for 40 years and they're now going to cross over the Jordan River. Why would God wait until now? Why would God wait until the flood season? I mean, of all the times, why couldn't have God brought them over when it was a little bit easier? Couldn't he have had them cross during the dry season? The Jordan, as I read, was at flood season because of the spring rains and the snow melting that descended from the Mount Hermon. So the river was deeper and wider and more violent than it was in any other part of the year. We say, why now, God? Why now? Well, of course, everything God does is intentional and guided by his own sovereign will and his infinite wisdom. And here's why I think God waited. This is our second point. God often waits to deliver us until the most inopportune times, humanly speaking, to show us that no obstacle is beyond his power to overcome. Now, I put waits in quotation marks because it's not as though God plans something and then sort of delays, or he's got, his sovereign plan in mind and makes an adjustment. In his infinite wisdom, he waits to act until the time he's always sovereignly determined to do so. But God does that, waiting from our perspective because he wants us to depend on him. He wants us to actually despair of our own abilities. He wants us to realize our inability and hopelessness apart from him. And I think in a church filled with so many competent and advanced and gifted people, this is a challenge, isn't it? To realize our own complete inability. And yet God sends some things our way. He allows us to go into situations sovereignly where we realize, no, I can't change that. I can't fix that. I can't heal that. I can't help that. Sometimes in order to show that his power is unlimited, that there's no obstacle in our lives that's beyond his power, he waits until, humanly speaking, it seems like the worst times. Well, in the case of the Israelites crossing the Jordan, God seems to wait so that he can showcase his power. You might think this morning that your situation has gotten so bad that there's nothing that can be done about it. Maybe it's a health diagnosis, maybe it's your marriage, maybe it's an estranged relationship with one of your kids, maybe it's a situation at work. You may think that your situation is irredeemable. Your marriage is beyond repair. Your loneliness is completely insurmountable. You might think the pain that you're dealing with may never subside. You may have received a diagnosis that you think this is just, there's no way beyond this. Well, God has the power to redeem your situation. God has the power to heal you. God has the power to reconcile your relationships. God has the power to deliver you. What you think is beyond hope is meant to drive you to your knees in desperate dependence upon God with a faith in a God who can do anything. One old-time theologian writes, Yahweh delights to show us his might in the face of our utter helplessness, apparently so that we cannot help seeing that we contribute nothing to our own deliverance. Now that brings me to a final connection that I want to make here. We've seen how this passage mirrors the great Exodus event. There are a lot of similarities and details that I didn't necessarily bring up even, where God took pity on his enslaved and helpless people who faced an insurmountable gulf between them and the home that God had prepared for them. He provided a way. The time of the Exodus, he provided a way. And here in Joshua, we see the situation the same. God provided a way when there was apparently no way. What stood between God's people was an unconquerable gulf, a devastating river overflowing its banks, and God showed his power among this helpless people by delivering them across it. Now you may ask, well, what does this have to do with me? Where am I in this story? Where do we find ourselves? Well, I mentioned to you that God's the main actor here, as he is in every story in the Bible. In fact, the whole Bible, God's book, is about God, his plan of salvation. These stories in Joshua are not primarily about us, but we can certainly find ourselves in the story. But here's the thing. We're not Joshua, the strong and courageous leader of God. We're not the spies sent on a clandestine mission to spot evil, although that sounds fun to me. We're not Rahab. We're Israel. We're the ones who constantly succumb to idolatry. We're the ones who murmur against God when things don't go our way. We're the ones who let anxiety and fear reign in our hearts. We're the ones who find ourselves with an uncrossable gulf that stands between us and the home that we were created for. Only the gulf, in our case, is not a river. What stands between us and the home that God made for us is actually far more deadly. It's our sin. Because of Adam and Eve and their rebellion against God in the garden, we're actually born sinners, every single one of us. We're born with a sin disease, with a sin curse. It affects the way we think. It affects our desires, our impulses, our priorities, our motivations. We enter this world at odds with God, not in harmony with God. And the sin disease that we inherit infects and taints everything we do. We're born corrupt and hell-bound without any hope of rescuing ourselves. But this story, like every one of the incredible stories in the Bible, is meant to prepare us for a greater rescue, a different sort of rescue. This story is meant to point us to God's ultimate rescuer, the one who would do what neither Joshua nor Moses could ever do, and that is reconcile a sinful people to a holy God. This story is meant to show us the way to our final home, the new heavens and the new earth, a place where we will be at rest with God. So here's our final point this morning. The way home for us was made through Jesus Christ, who himself walked on the sea as if it were dry land, en route to his death and resurrection in our place. Everything about this story shows us that God does not abandon his people. He's provided a way home for us. The story shows us that God has not left us alone, but he's made a way for our salvation. What stands between us and God, our sin, our rebellion, the sin curse passed on by Adam has been fully spanned. That gulf has been spanned by God's own Son. Our home is in heaven. That's the land that God promised us. As I said to you a couple of weeks ago, all the promises we see here are promises to us as well. The land that God promised is the new heaven and the new earth, a place of final rest. But again, there stands a gulf between us and the new heavens and the new earth that we cannot cross. But God sent his Son, the one who would gain entrance for us into that heaven by his obedience, the one who would die on a cross for our rebellion, so that when we trust in him, God brings us to himself. The Apostle Paul writes in such beautiful language that in Christ, God has brought us near. In those moments when we refuse to wait for the Lord, but we insist on seizing control, when we don't consecrate ourselves to meet with God, in those times when we let our hearts be captivated by other loves, and we let the idols of our hearts have free reign, and we let worry take over, and our hearts are terrorized by fear and uncertainty, or we feel like we've been too bad to approach God, that we're beyond hope, God tells us the same thing he said to the Israelites. Don't take your eyes off Jesus, the one who is the very image of God. Don't look at your own failures. Don't focus on your own shortcomings. Don't obsess about your own setbacks. Look at the obedience of Christ, the one who lived an obedient life for you, who died on the cross for your sin. Stay focused on Christ. Don't think about all you've done and all you haven't done. Think about all that God has done and promised in Christ. He has made a way for us, a way home for those who trust in him. Let's pray.